Bruchim Abiyim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi, and you have found Beit Virtuali. I have something completely different today. It's a bit of a community service. First of all, for those of you who are coming back to this the second, third, fourth, or 10th time, as might be the case, right up there are the timestamps for the 4 different parts of this video in case you need to skip ahead. For the rest of us, this is for folks out there, adults who have been asked to give a sermon, a drasha, a devar Torah for their synagogue, and or most especially bar and bat mitzvah students who might not be getting any guidance in this area. Now, in that last case, there's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of there. There are smaller congregations or certain congregations that just do not have the resources of other congregations. And if you find yourself not sure what to do, or you have a youth that you're trying to help and it's just not going together well, this is a tried and true practice that I've been using in 4 different countries, multiple different congregations for the last 15 years. It does work. Follow this process. You will have at the very least a usable sermon. It will probably be a darn good one. All right, so as mentioned earlier, this video is broken into 4 parts. First of all, we're just going to deal with some terminology because I have heard so many times people saying, I don't know what the difference between a sermon, drasha, devar Torah, shiur. I don't know what those words even mean. So what are we even talking about here? What's the difference? Should I care? Part number 2 is a description of the 7 different elements, the 7 different parts that make up a sermon as I'm going to teach them. Don't stop there when you're done with that part because you do not write the sermon in the same order that you give the sermon. That is part of the key secret to how to make this work. Which brings us to part 3. After we know what each of the parts are, part 3 will be how we actually approach writing it. What do we do first? What do we do second? Because the very first thing in the sermon will be one of the last things that we write. And then finally, we're going to end with some helpful tricks, a few general tips. Now, when I say general tips, I mean things that are critically important. Please pay attention to this. Please do not let this pass by. So stick to the end, listen to all this, and this applies for bar and bat mitzvah students as well as adults giving a sermon for their congregation. Okay, fun. Grab your favorite beverage, sit down, grab a notepad, and let's get started. First thing are these different terms. Are we giving a sermon? Are we giving a devar Torah? Are we giving a drasha? If you're coming from different religious traditions, perhaps you've even heard the term homily. What is it that I'm giving? Which does beg the question, if you are not Jewish and you have happened upon this video because it says how to write a sermon, can I use this if I am in a church? The answer is this is absolutely focused for Jewish learning, for Jewish concepts, Jewish style. But yes, this should work for a variety of different religions. The format is there. I'm just using my language in a Jewish context. All right, if you are a layperson or a bar and bat mitzvah student, you are generally giving what's called a devar Torah. That translates directly as a word of Torah. Please, 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 please do not say I'm giving a devar. A devar in modern Hebrew means thing. You've just said I'm giving a thing. A devar Torah is a limited sort of sermon. It means that you are taking a single aspect of Torah and you are elucidating that single aspect of Torah. This is the word that is usually associated both with lay people giving sermons and bar and bat mitzvah, although rabbis can give a devar Torah if they wish. What I've usually described to congregations is I tend on Friday evenings to give a devar Torah, and I tend to on Saturday mornings give a drasha. So what is a drasha? A drasha, well, drasha comes from the verb lidrosh, which is to explain something. And although it may be on a single point of Torah, it's generally on a subject instead of a single point of Torah. So I might give a drasha on prayer. I might give a drasha on gratitude. I might give a drasha on, well, politics seems to be the thing today. I don't tend to give those. But if it's on a subject that then uses verses from Torah or from Jewish tradition to back that up, that's a drasha. That's not a devar Torah. If we use the word shiur, shiur usually means lesson. And traditionally, it is the rav of a yeshiva or the rabbi of a congregation who gives the shiur. That doesn't mean that non-rabbis cannot give shiurim, but this is going to be a lot longer format. Members of Beit Virtuali come nearly weekly to hear my shiurim that I give on Sundays, and those tend to be 90 minutes to 2.5 plus hours. So for a lay sermon for your bar or bat mitzvah, you do not want to give a shiur. You most certainly want to give a devar Torah. And if you're coming from outside of Judaism and you've heard the word homily before, homily comes from the word homiletics. Homiletics is the highfalutin academic word that is the art of preaching and the art of writing a sermon. Put all together as homiletics, so then you offer a homily that's going to be much more associated with Roman Catholicism. But yes, in rabbinical school, we did have a professor of homiletics that we worked with. Okay, there's our terminology. That's it for part one. We are now on part two. What is the format of a sermon? The obvious question is, do I have flexibility? And the answer is, of course you have flexibility, but it is better to use a form until you know the form, and then we start breaking the form after we're comfortable with the form. So after you've given your 30th sermon, Drasha or Devar Torah, then yeah, go ahead and start breaking it. But for now, follow this. It will take away a lot of the anxiety because each of these sections is very focused, and each of these sections is no more than a few sentences long. And before I begin, remember, this is not the order you are going to write them in. If you actually want this to be, I'm going to say, a fun process, I know some people are terrified of public speaking, this will make the process easier. If you want to do that, please follow the order that I'm asking you to write them in. It makes a huge, huge difference. But here's the order that the final version will actually come in. Number one, a story, an anecdote, a joke. Now, before you get too excited, some people can tell a joke, some people don't. If you are one of the people who just doesn't tend to get reactions telling a joke, then I would highly suggest you choose a story or an anecdote rather than a joke. But what's the purpose of number one? If you walk into a synagogue and someone stands up to offer a drasha or devar Torah, and this is how they begin. My parasha is Parasha Miketz, and in Parasha Miketz we have the story of Joseph, who is in prison, and he listens to the dreams of... Yeah, hopefully you get it right there. You've already lost everyone. It is, I'm sorry, not interesting. And what's most interesting about it not being interesting is it's not very Jewish. We actually have examples of sermons that go back nearly 2,000 years. And one of the most common aspects of these ancient writings that we have is that the first part of a sermon always has nothing whatsoever to do with the actual text that we're going to be speaking about. And the reason is good psychology. This week, when I'm filming this is in the middle of Hanukkah. I don't know when you're going to be watching this, but later on this week, I'll be giving a drasha, Devar Torah, for Parshat Miketz, which is indeed the Joseph story, and it's about dreams. And I'm going to start that sermon by talking about Charlton Heston, the Ten Commandments, and Val Kilmer in The Prince of Egypt. Neither of which has a whole lot to do with Joseph, but the entire point is to say something that is interesting, hopefully someone or most people in some way will relate to, if at least in the most general way, a human sort of way. But the tension is what's so interesting. The tension is, for anyone who knows that Miketz is about Joseph and dreams and Pharaoh, in the back of everyone's mind is going to be, how is this person going to get from Charlton Heston and Val Kilmer to Parshat Miketz and Joseph's dreams, or Joseph's interpretation of dreams, to be more exact. So this is the one place where we can get personal. I'll talk later on about why we shouldn't get personal in most sermons. But we can start with a story that is emotional or amusing, something that is interesting and important to us. And if it's interesting or important to us, then there's a chance that it will resonate with someone else. One of my favorite sermons here in Germany from a bat mitzvah student, Leah, many, many years ago, she started with a chewed up Bic pen, holding it up and saying, if I offered to sell this to you, how much would you buy it for? What's the value of this thing? And of course, people are kind of shrugging and rolling their eyes. And then she said, what if I told you this was the pen that my grandmother gave to me 5 seconds before she died? Right? Surprise, complete change. And it was a sermon about things like dolphin skins and the other crazy stuff that went into the building of the tabernacle. And she was trying to get the point across that what is of value to us is relative. A chewed up Beck pen, I'm not even going to spend a penny for. But to her, which actually her grandmother hadn't given that to her, but the point was made, value is relative. And when we read something in the Torah that seems kind of silly, it might be because it's just simply relative to the culture at the time. It was one of the most brilliant sermons I've ever heard by adult or youth, and it started with a Bic pen being held up. All right, how do you come up with a story or an anecdote or a description of a television series or a favorite scene from a movie or a favorite experience at a symphony or a favorite symphony? It doesn't matter. All of these things can go into this first slot, and how we get to the first slot, that's coming up later. Part 2, a description of the central problem that we have encountered in Torah. What in the world do I mean by central problem? Central question. We'll get to that later on, but we are going to come up with some sort of question that we want to answer. So in Joseph's case, for example, we could ask the question, why was Joseph so helpful when he was in prison? Well, if that's the question that we're later going to answer, then this is the section where we describe him being in prison. This is the most objective part of our entire Devar Torah. This is the part that we're going to look very clearly at the text that is in the Torah or the Haftarah, if we happen to be writing our Devar Torah on the prophetic text or the text from the Tanakh. And this is where we put it into our own words. And what hopefully should already be hidden behind the scenes clear on this one is we're not going to give a Devar Torah on the entire parasha. Our Devar Torah is not a summary of all 6 chapters of Genesis that make up Parashat Bereshit. The worst Devar Torah given in the world is the one that says, in chapter 1 of Bereshit, this happens. In chapter 2, this happens. In chapter 3, this happens. It's not a Devar Torah. It's just simply a summary of what's written. What we're going to be doing in part 2 is a summary of the tiny bit of Torah that leads us to the question, which is number 3, our question. Now, when I say question, I can call it a question, a concern, something that has animated us in the text, which again, I'll get to in the next section. But this question should be something that we can clearly formulate and clearly answer. Unless we want our entire Devar Torah to be 42, we should not say, what is the meaning of life? Those who just glazed over, ignore that. Those who are chuckling, you're welcome. But these don't have to be complicated questions, and the Torah is filled with stuff that happens that makes us ask questions. Why was it when Abraham was going down to Egypt and he was already an old man, did he realize for the first time in his entire life, according to the text, that he found his wife to be pleasant to look at? That seems to me to be a question worth asking. Why was Moses so angry all the time? Is a question. I had a wonderful student of mine who rode horses who asked the question on, what is this thing about you cannot yoke 2 different animals together? And so we drew it out on the page. That was her question. She didn't understand it until she actually saw that, oh, here's a horse on the yoke, okay, the thing that is around their necks allows them to pull the wagon, and then here's the oxen who's shorter, and oh my goodness, this is actually going to cause the yoke to be strangulating around the oxen. How cool is that this is actually about animal cruelty 4,000 years ago? But the first question was simply, hey, it says you can't do this. Why is that? That doesn't seem to make sense to me. A clear, formulated question. Why did this happen? Why was this person saying that? Why does the Torah write it that the Eternal says that? Clear, concise question. All right, we're moving on. Number 4, we begin to answer our question that we've posed, and our first answer comes from Jewish sources. This is our most research-oriented part of our Devar Torah. We have to spend a little bit of time with Rabbi Google. If you are bar or bat mitzvah age and you have internet restrictions, I highly recommend that you do this with your parents. As a matter of fact, parents out there who are looking at this for your youth, I highly recommend you offer this part of yourselves for the drasha, but not the rest of it. This is not your Devar Torah. This is not your drasha. This is not your sermon. This is your youth's. Please let them write it. But boy, is it great when you are part of the questioning back and forth, the dialogue of our tradition. Why do you think it says that? So we research our question, and we can just type that question into Google for a start. That might not give us very good answers, and in the next section, I'll give a few hints on better ways that we can engage with Rabbi Google. But what we're looking for are classic ways that this particular question has already been answered, or at least something related to it has already been answered. Part of the challenge is that 35% of human beings on the face of this planet are Christian, whereas 0.2% of people on the face of this planet are Jewish, which means if you type a question into Google, you're probably going to get an answer from a Christian perspective back. And so you're probably going to need to include keywords like Parshat Miketz or in the Torah or from Jewish sources. And then that will start getting you what you want. But if you type into Google right now, why was Moses always so angry? You get a lot of answers to that. I'm just peeking really quickly after I just did that. The first page after page after page is actually Christian answers. But if I add a few Hebrew keywords in there, in the Torah, in Parashat Bo, etc., you're going to start getting to some Jewish sources. And the sources you want to choose are ones that are interesting to you. Answers that you find, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. Grab 20 different answers, 20 different sources, print them out, write on them, highlight them, and pick your favorite 3. Yes, 3 is an arbitrary number here, but pick 3. My favorite advice when people are stuck on which one should I choose, I say something old, something new, and something weird, right? Some old Jewish commentator like Rashi said this about my question. I watched Rabbi Paul Strasko on Beit Virtuali for a year, and he said this about it. And then I was watching that network television program. Do we still watch network television? And I was watching that thing on YouTube or on TikTok where someone was reading the minds of their cat and they said this. Okay, that's the weird one, but you know what? If it actually helps answer the question, use it. Do something a little off base. Maybe your favorite poet commented on it. If your favorite poet was Leonard Cohen, he probably did. Which brings us down to, and we've now been working with our texts for quite some time, your answer. And this doesn't have to be new. You can say, Rabbi X says this and person Y says this, my cat whisperer on TikTok says this, and I kind of agree with the cat whisperer and I agree with Rashi, but I think that it's this. Doesn't have to be long, just a statement of what you think the answer is. And if you can't find an answer, then to be honest about that. I've spent all this time finding these opinions and I am completely stuck. I find this to be such a complicated question that I'm going to choose to keep on thinking about this. Boy, what a powerful sermon. Wouldn't it be great if more of us just said, I don't have an answer, I just need to think more on it, but here's what I found? Don't think like you have to be the rabbi of the community. You are the Shlach Tzibur. You are the ambassador sent by the community to teach Torah, and part of the teaching of Torah is to teach that not all of us have answers, and the Torah certainly tries to give us more than one. All right, number 6. Here's the most creative writing part of the entire Devar Torah process, and this is the why should we care? If I ask a question like, why did Abraham only when he was in his 90s figure out that his wife was pleasing to look at, as is said by the text? Why in the world should we care today? And this is one of the coolest part of the entire Devar Torah process. If Torah exists 2, 3, 4,000 years ago, who cares? It's a different culture, it's a different people. Yes, we've got aspects of our humanity that we can relate, but we do have at a detailed level different problems. And I can promise you, as cool as it would have been, Moses did not have a TikTok channel. Although, honestly, King Saul would have had the coolest TikTok channel out of all of them. Or Bruria. If you don't know who that is, look her up. But every question that we ask, we should be able to pull from the Torah into the present. If I'm asking a question on why was Abraham so daft that at age 90 he had such a strange realization, do we ever have questions in our life about how we perceive the appearance of others? When something causes us to perceive the appearance of others to be different today than we did yesterday? Isn't that central to part of what makes it very difficult to grow up today? Or quite frankly, to be an adult? That silly question about something silly that happened in Torah is something that is causing most of you probably a huge amount of stress. So why not ask that question and then bring it in today as we talk about how we perceive others and what that means. If we're talking about Moses and his anger management issues, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, just subscribe to this channel and keep on watching these videos. Well, then the next question is, do we ever experience anger today? Well, see, we've got a character who has constant issues with anger. Do you think that there's anything that we could possibly learn about that by thinking about that today? That's pulling the Torah into the present. Put differently, we might think that Torah is an incredibly old, outmoded thing, but what we'll find out is people are people. And if we ask these clear questions and then we say, okay, how can I relate that to something today? Then we're going to be able to come up with a clear statement of, and this is why, after asking this question, this is something that we should think about today, or this is something that's all around us today. Here's why it matters. Put it differently, if we're not interested in why our sermon matters, I promise you, no one who's watching us give our sermon is going to care either. So we're going to want to choose a question that's interesting, and we're going to want to pull it into the present and state why it's interesting to today. And then number 7, we reconnect it back with number 1. If we told a story and an anecdote or a joke, then we now try to say, when I was talking about the voice of God as being spoken by Charlton Heston or by Val Kilmer, then I'm going to bring it back at the end of that sermon, and you can watch later on this week if you're watching this in real time and see that the answer at the very end is going to have something to do with rewiring our expectations when we read Torah to not be expecting a voice as we would hear a literal reverbing voice. And every time we hear that voice, that is not what Torah is trying to get us to hear. All right, those are the 7 parts of the sermon, but that's not how we write them. We do not write them in that order. And if you actually want to turn this into something that is digestible, because if you are watching this, most likely you have Googled this question, how do I write a sermon, in desperation, and you're stressed. If you've got enough time, and enough time for a bar bat mitzvah is to write a sermon, you should have a few months to do it. If you're an adult, yes, you can do this over the course of a few days. If you're a youth, you can do this over the course of a few days. Your ideal is to do each of these exercises once a week over the course of actually 8 weeks until you get to a completed sermon. If you have less time, like you've waited till 1 week before your bar bat mitzvah to do this, or you've got 1 week to write an emergency sermon, then this is going to be something like you do something in the morning and then something in the evening, and you do that over the course of the week. These are still bite-sized parts of the process, and so here's how we do it. Step number 1, and this is not part of the 7 parts of the sermon, but it's read your parsha. Now, that's easier said than done because some parshiot will take a long time to read. So if you are a bar or bat mitzvah student, then you take just the part that you are reading. Depending on your synagogue, depending on your stream of Judaism, this could be 3 verses, 10 verses. You might be doing the entire haftarah or just a part of the haftarah. You take what it is that you are reading in public if that is a part of your celebration. If you are an adult, yeah, go ahead and read the entire thing if you feel like you want to do that. But you also have the ability to read the triennial cycle. If your synagogue doesn't publish what the triennial cycle is, or if it doesn't publish what the reading for that week is going to be in the synagogue, you can go to hebcal.com. It will tell you what the current parsha is. You can look up in the Hebrew calendar what the parsha is going to be in the future. You have to be very, very careful because there's a diaspora calendar, there's an Israeli calendar. They can be different at certain times of year. Generally speaking, if you're in Israel, use the Israeli calendar. Generally speaking, if you're not in Israel, use the diaspora calendar if you are conservative or Orthodox. If you are Reform, you're probably using the Israel calendar, even if you're in the diaspora. When in doubt, go to the main website for your stream of Judaism. I will try to include links down below to some of the resources that I'm talking about, okay? But if you go to Hebcal, it will take you for your parsha to the entire series of verses, each of the traditional aliyot, the different breakdown of how Torah is going to be read, and then it will show you current triennial cycle, and that will be, depending on the parsha, roughly a third, so a lot less to read. And here's the trick. It's not that you read it, it's how you read it. You want to keep a notebook next to you. You want to have a very erasable pencil. You want to have a highlighter on your computer if you're reading this online. But what you do is you read and you mark every moment that you feel something. Now, feel something doesn't mean you start crying, doesn't mean you start laughing. It means that something resonates with you. It doesn't mean it resonates in a good way or a bad way. It just means that you read something and you went, I prefer the term animation. Any moment of animation, whether it is positive, negative, right, hopefully you get the point. Anything that makes you think, and this doesn't have to be exciting parts of the Torah. If you have one of those wonderful parshiot that are a long listing of people who were born to someone else, maybe it's a name that jumps out at you. Oh, that's an interesting name. I promise you there's going to be something interesting about that name that you can find out with some research. Maybe it's just then a meta question. Why in the Torah are there so many genealogies of who gave birth to whom? If that's the question that comes out, that's actually a heck of a question. If you have some of those exciting parts later on in the book of Numbers and Bamidbar about the amount of gifts that were brought by this prince on this particular date, maybe a number jumps out at you, maybe a name, maybe the materials that are being brought. Maybe the question is, how much gold is that? And so that's the question. You start looking up, well, how much is that? How could it possibly be that they had that much gold back in the day? But every moment that we have any sense of animation with the text, we put a little check mark, we highlight that, we mark that down, because every one of those is a potential question. The trick here is to not glaze over. There's no way around it. We have to bring our best selves to this moment, otherwise we've already lost. But if we step into it saying, I'm going to look for anything at all that causes me to go, even if that's the bar that I set, we're going to find several things that cause us to go, Depending on which parsha we have, there might be a lot of things that cause us to go, Then we take each of those check marks and highlights and we write them down into thing 1 that I animated with when I saw this in text. And in front of me, I have 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 different things that I found interesting. And I get to step 2, which is asking my question. So the very first thing that I'm going to write is actually the 3rd section in the Devar Torah itself. And there's a couple ways to do this. First of all, if I've only come up with one question or one part of what I've read that I've even found remotely interesting, then I'd better find my question about that. But if I've got 3 or 4 possibilities, I'm going to try to formulate as clear of a question as possible. And there's a test. There's a real easy test to do. When you type the question as is into Google, does it come back with results? Results that seem to be related to your question, even if on first try they're not necessarily answers that come from a Jewish tradition. If you're getting a lot of responses back from your question, it means that you're going to have an easier time researching that. There's dialogue about that out there. Of course, if you get absolutely no answers whatsoever, that might be really interesting as well. But you want to turn your question into something clear, clean, snappy. What does this mean? Why did this happen? Why did this person say this? Why was this included in the Torah? What was not spoken here? What did this person feel? Since very seldom does the Torah say what people felt. All right, after you have a clear, formulated question, your question has come from something. So let's say your question is, why do we have all these genealogies in Torah? The formulation of the text that brought you to that is, in my parsha. So you can say that now. You've already said some anecdotes, some jokes, something before that. Yeah, we'll get to that in a bit. But since you've already started off with something interesting, now you can say, in my parsha, we have the most boring section of anything I've ever read in my entire life. And it's this person gave birth to this person, and this person gave birth to this person, and this person lived over 900 years, and I wanted to scream because what the heck is this all about? And then you just quote one or two of those verses, and you're done. Because the next part linearly will be, which leads me to the question of, why are all these genealogies written? See how it works? The first thing that we write is our question. The second thing that we write is what brought us to the question. But when the congregation's hearing it, they will hear the description of what's in Torah, which leads to the question. See? We start with the question, then we start filling it out. We're going to see it in a different order. All right. Now the order of what we do should be pretty obvious. Part 4, the answers from Jewish tradition. Now, I said I was going to give a couple tricks of what to do here. The first trick is to, in quotes, at the beginning of every Google inquiry, to write Parashat Bereshit, Parashat Bamidbar, Parashat Vayeshev, whatever your parsha is, simply include those keywords into your search, and that will, in many cases, narrow it down to more Jewish sources. But you're going to look not for arbitrary answers, you're going to look for things that are interesting to you, and not things that you necessarily agree with. If you find something with which you profoundly disagree, that's pretty cool as well. How nice that we actually have the ability to be in dialogue with people with whom we disagree. And if you have a congregation where everyone feels that you have to agree with everything and not disagree, what a great mentorship. Even if you are 12 years old or 13 years old, what a great mentorship for the congregation if you are able to see, here are two voices in Judaism that completely disagree with each other, and I disagree with both of them. Here's why I think they're still important and powerful to read. You have just modeled something that is part of how we really do heal the world. Okay, next step after that should be pretty obvious. After you have then written down, right, after you've done the research, then you don't just copy and paste, although you can quote. So Rashi says, and then you can quote. Rabbi Paul says, and then you can quote. Or if you don't want to quote directly, that crazy online rabbi from Beit Virtuali says this a lot. Because there are a few things that I say a lot. Great, say it like that. Make sure you give credit if it's not your idea. Make sure that you either directly quote it if it's a direct quote. And when you're delivering your sermon, change your voice just slightly when you're quoting someone, just slightly. That's another video, how to deliver a sermon. After you've formulated those, then you formulate your own answer. I agree with this person. I disagree with this person for this reason. My idea is this. I believe that this is the answer to the question. Or I'm still very confused, although this is what I have learned by researching the answer to this question. Then the next section that we write is why we should care about that. Again, what we do is we spend some time thinking, if this were happening today, how would I describe it? So we have the story of Moses meeting his future wife Zipporah at a well, and there are bandits there that are threatening her, and he fights them off. Well, maybe we can't relate to fighting off bandits at a well, but can we relate to defending someone who is being unfairly bullied? Can we relate if we were the person being bullied and someone came to our defense? See, all of these things have some sort of similarity we can find in our lives, or the lives of our parents, or the lives of our friends. I've experienced something like this. My friends have experienced something like this. My family experienced something like this. I saw this on the news, and I'm really touched by this thing that I saw happening in Florida. And now that we've gotten this far, we then write sections 1 and 7 together. That's the secret. At this point, we ask ourselves the question, what does this remind me of? Has this reminded me of a story, my favorite television show, my favorite movie, my favorite series of books, something that happened to me 5 years ago, a story that my grandmother told me? Whatever it is, whatever has come to our mind, what this has reminded us of, then we write our opening section, we place it at the very beginning, and see the really cool trick here is this tension of the listener of how is this person going to get from this opening story to the parasha? Well, you've already done it because the actual trick is it comes the opposite direction. You write most of your Devar Torah and then you add the story at the end, and of course then you connect it because you've already put that together. How does the story relate to the sermon? That's part 7. You reconnect it. Remember when I said at the very beginning that this happened to my grandparents? Well, now look at what we've learned. All right, let's summarize. 2 different slides here. Slide number 1, the 7 different elements in the order that we're going to read them. Element number 1, a story, an anecdote, a joke. Element number 2, the description of what in Torah we read, that tiny part of Torah that led us to the question that we're asking. Number 3, the clearly formulated question itself. Section 4, answers from Jewish tradition. General guidelines, something old, something new, something slightly off kilter, something strange. Section 5, your answer. Here's what I think. Answer 6, how does that relate to today? Or why should we care? Why is this relevant? Why does this matter? How is this a reflection of the reality of this moment in all of our lives? And finally, number 7, the conclusion, tying back. See, I had the story or joke at the beginning. It wasn't just arbitrary. Here's what we learned from it. Here's what we can take from it. Here's what we can do with our lives. Okay, next slide, the order of the work that we're actually doing. In summary, work number 1, read our parsha or our haftarah, or the part of our parsha or haftarah that we're going to be dealing with in public. Then the first thing that we write is our question. That will be 1 sentence, 2 at the absolute most. If it's a complicated question, you shouldn't make it a complicated question. A clear 1 sentence. That's a 1-week writing assignment if you're doing this week by week. 1 sentence. Then we go backwards to section number 2. We write the part of Torah, the summary that led us to that question. That is 3 or 4 sentences maximum, maybe 5 if it's somewhat complex. It's not longer than that. Then we flip down to section 4 is the third thing that we write. See why I'm using slides. Answers from Jewish voices. Each of these are going to be 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences long. This is really the bulk of your sermon. So-and-so says this, so-and-so says this. The words that you have to use are what weaves the voices in together, and then you just quote or restate what these voices have said. But make sure you're giving each one enough time so that it's clearly understood what it is that Rashi is saying, what crazy Rabbi Strasco is saying. 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences for each different voice. What I believe. This is one of the 2 sections that has the potential of being much shorter or much longer. This could be a couple sentences. This could be 5 or 6. Don't make it longer than that. Why should we care? Again, could have a lot of flexibility from 2 or 3 sentences, 5 or 6 sentences. And then our story, anecdote, or joke. This is going to be 5, 6, 7 sentences, unless it's a joke, in which case it might be pretty quick. And then jumping down to number 7, tying it together. This is 3, 4, 5 sentences. Now, don't take that as hard and fast. If it's less or more than that, it's not going to be good. You write what's necessary for it. But part of this is just to say that if you're starting to write this a few months out from your bar bat mitzvah, or even 6 months out, if you just do 1 section a week, this becomes pretty cut and dry. And some sections require very little writing. Once again, if you are bar bat mitzvah who is writing this, and you're a parent of a bar bat mitzvah who's listening to this, I would highly ask of you as one rabbi, if you want to help out with the dialogue, the research, the asking questions. Don't look at the sermon itself until they are done. And then, of course, there's helping with the grammar and putting things together, but not until the ideas are already out there. I know you want to help and make it better. Let it be your youth's voices. In every congregation where I've been the rabbi, the parents were not allowed to hear the sermon or see the sermon until the dress rehearsal. And the reason I did that is because it's not your Devar Torah. The reason that we have a Devar Torah for bar and bat mitzvah is because interpreting Torah is part of what makes us a Jewish adult. It is part of what elevates us. It's part of what is so beautifully unique in our tradition. And even if we're trying to take stress away, what we're actually doing is we're taking away an opportunity of growth, an opportunity of evolution for our youth. All right, last section. These are the general tips, although they should be taken very, very seriously, unless you are a professional and practiced public speaker. Some of these are more for bar and bat mitzvah students. Some of these are more for adults giving a drasha. The original version of these that I wrote was actually for a congregational website for when I was not there, a place where I was part-time for a bit, and they were having lay sermons when I was gone. So this comes from those initial guidelines that I wrote. Guideline number 1 has 2 different perspectives. It's either Be authentic or be brutally honest. So be authentic, what do I mean? If you are, for your day job or night job, a stand-up comedian, then it makes a lot of sense for your Devar Torah to be really based in humor. Don't try to be a great academic if your day job or night job is to be a comedian. On the other hand, if your day or night job is to be an academic, don't try to be a comedian. If we generally are not the world's best joke teller, then we're not going to become the world's best joke teller when we're offering a word of Torah. And this is the being brutally honest with ourselves. Listen, if we are working in technology, or if we're an engineer and all day long we're looking at the ins and outs, nuts and bolts of how things work, then what an amazingly interesting idea for a Devar Torah to talk about something technical. Be yourself. Point number 2. Avoid universalizing language such as, we all believe that. Chances are not all people believe that. It's even much worse if you try something like, all right-thinking people believe that. Judaism is based on the idea that we are allowed to debate and disagree with each other. And the second that we have said all people believe or all people should believe that, in most cases, if this is one of those sharp issues of the day, you're going to lose a percentage of your congregation by saying something like that. Which brings to point number 3, be aware and respectful of political differences. It's easy when we get to that part of the sermon that is, how is this relevant today, to veer into the areas of public policy that are obvious. However, be aware that even the most homogeneous congregations do have diversity, and that really should be respected. Number 4, avoid lots of I statements. Yes, in the guidelines, I've given certain spaces where I has to be used or I can be used. When we're telling a joke, when we're telling an anecdote, when I was 5 years old. But if we find ourselves saying me and I think this, me, that for the entire sermon, it's probably not going to go over very well any more than we would want to hear someone talking to us for 10 minutes saying I and me every third word. One of the exceptions is if you use yourself as the via negativa. So if you want to see the wrong way to do it, here's how I did it the wrong way. Try to avoid you statements. You all should do this. Do you, who I'm talking to now, want to hear me say you shouldn't do this every few words? Right, exactly. So avoid you statements in a sermon. We works very, very well as long as you're not doing the universalizing we. We are sometimes faced with this challenge. Also they, them when it comes to othering a group. This in this year should probably be pretty self-evident, but it's not always self-evident. Anything that places the person giving the Devar Torah in a position of superiority to someone else should be avoided at all costs. Even though we don't always live up to this, none of us are better than anyone else. That should be without saying, but sometimes in public speaking we forget that. All right, the great moment of hypocrisy. Be aware of length. In the English language, generally speaking, 100 words is 1 minute of speaking. Your absolute maximum, and I mean this for both adult lay Devar Torah as well as bar and bat mitzvah, should be 1,000 words, 10 minutes of speaking. And yes, you can go ahead and laugh and point the hypocrisy to me because the average length of sermon on this channel is at about 18 and a half minutes. This is my job. For my first 5, 6, 7 years, all of my sermons were under 10 minutes. They started stretching. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I'm willing to take that risk for a bar bat mitzvah or for your layperson Devar Torah. Keep it to 10 minutes maximum unless you are actually a professional speaker. Your sense of time as you are up on the bima is not the same experience that people in the congregation are having. All right, here's a little bit more complicated one. The best sermons are really ones where we don't preach. And I know that seems a little bit strange, especially depending on what tradition you come from. But one of the secrets that some of you I've told is that I almost never give a sermon that I think you need to hear. When I give a sermon, I'm talking about stuff that I'm actually struggling with right now. And the assumption is that as we're all humans and we're similar, if I talk essentially about something with which I'm struggling, then my assumption is some of you are probably struggling with that as well. If we think, oh, you know what, this sermon needs to hear something about, and then we go and get really preachy, we're going to lose everyone right away because it's not an authentic voice. It will come across as preachy. And once again, basic ethics, don't do to someone else what would be reprehensible to us. We don't tend to like people preaching at us. So if we're working through our own issues and it's presented in that sort of tone of voice, even if we're dealing with very difficult subjects, it will be heard much better. Some very technical stuff. Unless, again, you are a seasoned professional speaker, write out your Devar Torah. Even among rabbis, I know just a handful that do their sermons without texts. And even then, when I do that, I promise you, I've actually spent the entire week going over it in a very specific process to get it into my mind. There's nuts and bolts with that. Print it out. Make sure you have page numbers on it. Bar and Bat Mitzvah students, I'm speaking to you on this one. I had a student have their papers fall on the floor. The pages weren't numbered. We took 5-10 minutes in the middle of the sermon to try to figure out what the order of the papers were. It was not a pleasant experience. Number your pages. When you print it out, print it in large print, 24 font, and you adults will absolutely hate this one. Market research has shown it's easier to public read. No one else is going to see it if you put your font as Comic Sans. Yes, the one thing you should never use for work or for academics, but it actually is really, really easy to read if it's on the pulpit in front of you. Make sure that none of the page turns are in the middle of a sentence, and practice reading it out loud multiple times. I will put together another of these videos in a few weeks or a few months, which is how to actually deliver a sermon. But for right now, make sure you've got something printed out that if you drop it on the floor, you're going to be able to put it back together really quickly and then have a joke in the moment saying, thank goodness for that silly YouTube video that I watched that said to make sure the numbers are on the page. Last guideline, not going to be easy for everyone. Have fun. Not everyone's a public speaker. I realize that I love it, and so that means that I've got a skewed opinion on this one. But for those of you doing your bar bat mitzvah, this might be the only time you ever public speak in your life. Unlike things like marriage, which ideally I suppose should happen once in your life. You only get one bar bat mitzvah. And that's not to add more stress. It's just to point to how singular this moment is. You are my Torah teacher in this moment. You are your parents' Torah teacher in this moment. We, as a people, 0.2% of the population of the world, still exist because we teach each other Torah, because when we come of age at age 12 or 13, we take it upon ourselves the responsibility to teach each other Torah. Even if we're terrified, even if we don't feel that we can have fun, we at least understand that we are engaging in something that is central to who we are, central to our survival. And maybe we don't use the word fun with that, but it's something that we can lift up our chins and smile and realize that we're doing something pretty cool. All right, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for being a part of Beit Virtuali. If you've come to this from the middle of nowhere, make sure that you like, make sure you subscribe. If you want educational supplements, join Beit Virtuali. The Patreon link is down below. We've got now over 40 hours of archived online education. Beit Virtuali is not meant to be a replacement for your brick and mortar synagogue, but become a member of Beit Virtuali. And if there's more things like this that you want, just let me know and I will absolutely record them, or I will absolutely do personalized adult education. Or if there's enough bar and bat mitzvah students out there whose families become members of Beit Virtuali, then I'll do some bar and bat mitzvah education. Although the truth of the matter is, the brains of bar and bat mitzvah students, they can essentially be in the same education that adults are in, which is maybe one of the coolest points behind this entire process. All right, this is one of the longest videos I've done. It's been done with the ability of you to be able to jump through, take what you need from it. Let me know if you have any questions, comments down below. Thank you for being here. Take care. We'll see you next time.
וקול שופר הריעו לפני המלך אדוני